Thank you, Alex. Again, it's pleasant to be standing in a room that has people in it. The Gutenberg Bible was apparently overall a successful publishing project. The surviving copies, including fragments preserved as binding waste, show from the combined evidence of ownership and donor inscriptions, localizable illuminations, and localizable bindings, a quite broad sale of copies, widely in Germany, but also with copies marketed to Austria, Bohemia, Poland, the northern and southern Low Countries, and very likely from there to Spain, England, and Sweden. The Bodleian copy comes from the Carmelite house of Heilbronn in Baden-Württemberg, the Nesselkloster, or cloister in the nettles, a then cultivated pilgrimage site where in the 1440s the Virgin Mary miraculously appeared to a peasant woman in the fields outside the town. We do not, it should be noted, have any evidence of original sales of the Gutenberg Bible in France or Italy. Excuse me. When we consider this marketing of copies, which was, of course, the entire point of the Bible project, we see that it would be preferable if this iconic monument of European typography was always and familiarly known as the Gutenberg Fust Bible, for it is in the sale of copies that evidence for Fust's role becomes prominent. In fact, it is likely that Gutenberg had no role outside the printing shop. By this sale of copies, which took place over a period of years, a nearly identical text of the Vulgate Bible came before the eyes of dozens and presumably hundreds of widely scattered readers, in striking contrast to the readers of 15th century or older handwritten Bibles. However, the multiplicative power of the Gutenberg Bible text was exerted by just a handful of copies of the book. That is, those copies whose first readers were not ecclesiastics in churches, but rather compositors in printing shops who used the Gutenberg Bible as exemplars for creating new editions of the Latin Bible. Then some of those new editions themselves became the exemplars of yet other editions, and so forth. We know that 5 editions of the Bible were set directly from the Gutenberg Bible, and quite remarkably, we can identify 3 surviving copies of the Gutenberg Bible that were actually in printing shops and touched by the hands of compositors. In each case, they were handled with care so that the sheets, after being used by the printers, could be gathered into copies and themselves sold. One of these, slide 3 please, the Gutenberg Bible now at Cambridge University Library could well be the latest copy of the Bible to find an original customer, because it was not finished being used in the printing shop until late 1469 or possibly early 1470. And you have a handout in which I have laid out what I refer to as the setting profiles of the 5 different editions set from the Gutenberg Bible, identified according to whether that copy that their compositors used had, in the relevant quires where there was duplicate setting, either setting A or setting B, and each one is different from the others. These 5 editions can be called children of the Gutenberg Bible. Slide 4, Johann Mentalin's Bible, completed in Strasbourg, not after 1460, and the first book printed in that city. Slide 5, Albrecht Pfister's Bible, completed in Bamberg, not after 1461, and again the first book printed there. Slide 6, the beautiful 1462 Mainz Bible of Johann Fust, former business associate of Gutenberg, and of his servant, Peter Schoeffer. Slide 7, the second Strasbourg Bible, printed by Heinrich Eggerstein, not after May 1466. And slide 8 is the fourth Strasbourg Bible, again printed by Eggerstein, not after the March 1470, for the setting of which he used a different Gutenberg Bible than that which was available to him 4 years earlier. We can further trace the children of these editions, 2 of which were barren. Mentalin's edition was the exemplar Slide 9, please, for a Strasbourg printing of Kirche 1473, assigned to a shop generally called the R Printer, which I believe to be in fact Mentalin's own shop, operated at that time in association with his son-in-law, Adolf Rusch. It stands out among the early German editions as it is the only one set with a Roman type, a fashion that did not take hold north of the Alps, although in this same brief period of the early 1470s, several Augsburg printers also published books using Roman fonts. No Bible was set from either the Bamberg Bible of Pfister or from Eggerstein's Third Bible, and so their textual contents reached dead ends. Eggerstein's first Bible was the exemplar for his second, not after 1468, and one or the other of these editions, slide 10 please, was the exemplar for the first Basel Bible, printed by Berthold Ruppel about 1472 or 1473. Now, parenthetically, about this Ruppel edition, most bibliographical sources have dated it to Kirche 1468, but without evidence, and this too early dating seems to be more or less unkillable. Baud Inc., in fact, dates the Ruppel Bible just a little later to Kirche 1469, and they note this specifically, quote, as dated by Needham from paper evidence, citing a specific page of a specific publication of mine. But on that page, I wrote of this first Basel Bible, quote, its true completion date is Kirche 1472. No printing in Basel can be dated earlier than 1472. Finally, slide 11. The 1462 Fustin Schiffer Bible had a relatively late child, 9 years after it was published. That is the Bible printed in Rome, 1471, by Conrad Sweinheim and Arnold Panartz. This was the first printed Bible made in Italy or anywhere outside German-speaking lands. From this child arose a numerous progeny, like the seed of Abraham, extending eventually all the way to the officially authorized editions of the Roman Catholic Church, the Sixtine Vulgate of 1590 and its corrected replacement, the Clementine Vulgate of 1592, which continued to be reprinted well into the 20th century. This is the descent of the Gutenberg Bible that will call for the closest attention in our final lecture. Mostly small but substantive differences between the two settings of 155 pages of the Gutenberg Bible, distributed over 10 quires, as in your handout, enable us to determine the setting profile of each of the copies that were used as exemplars in these later printing shops of Strasbourg, Bamberg, and Mainz. Some are conscious corrections, some are typographical errors, a few are difficult to classify. Only the copy used by Johann Mentalin had all 10 relevant quires in the original settings. That is, it was made up entirely for these quires of pages printed off before the decision to increase the print run was taken. The other 4 editions listed on the handout were set from Gutenberg Bibles containing a mixture of setting A and setting B sheets. Although in the case of number 4, the first Bible printed by Heinrich Eggerstein, and the second Bible printed in Strasbourg, the setting copy had all first settings of the relevant pages, except for the first sheet of the 14th quire, with the beginning of the books of Kings, where the outer sheet of the quire was of the second setting and the inner sheets of the first. A few other of the recorded Gutenberg Bibles, including the former Doheny Volume 1, now at Keio University in Tokyo, likewise have quire 14 in this mixed state. The Krakow Proofs. Excuse me. Earlier than any of these children of the Gutenberg Bible is just a portion of one printed Bible page of truly remarkable interest that has been generally overlooked. This is slide 12, please. There survives in Krakow in the Jagiellonian Library a partial leaf, which is all that remains of what seems to be a trial attempt or first idea of printing a Bible in Mainz in Gutenberg's DK workshop using his earlier and larger type. It is one of 5 paper leaves that were removed no later than 1900 from some, unfortunately, unrecorded binding in the library. That binding must, by every probability, have come from Mainz, for the leaves are cut-down remnants of an account book kept by a Mainz cloth merchant, which includes entries of payments, money owed, and other transactions dating between 1383 and 1394. This account book must have come to Gutenberg's DK shop as waste paper. Conceivably, I cannot restrain myself from speculating it was an account book of one of Gutenberg's forebears. Slide 13, please. Wherever it came from, it was used in the shop, despite being extensively written on, for proof printing of 3 different texts, an edition of the Donatus School Grammar, which is what you see, one small portion for February and the beginning of March of what would have been a multi-sheet wall calendar giving positions of the planets, and a single imperfect page preserving 24 lines, slide 14, please. And then that single imperfect page preserving 24 lines in double columns of an early portion of Genesis, all 3 of these being set, of course, with the DK type. We know already from various fragmentary binding waste survivals that Gutenberg's DK shop produced multiple editions of the Grammar of Donatus. Although none of those fragments can be matched with the Krakow Proofs, their family resemblance is close. As for the wall calendar, a portion of the finished calendar for which this is a proof, printed on vellum, did survive as waste in the binding of a 15th-century manuscript from the convent of the Benedictines of Schönau, northwest of Mainz. It was preserved in the Landesbibliothek of Wiesbaden, but was lost and presumably destroyed in World War II. This wall calendar is one of the great puzzle pieces of early Mainz printing, for although the planetary positions of the calendar were calculated for the year 1448 by an extensive body of typographical evidence to which I subscribe, the calendar could not have been printed before about 1456 or 1457, a time when the planets mentioned would have been nowhere near any of the zodiacal locations stated in the calendar. But this is not our immediate problem. The survival of these printed proof leaves in a single binding suggests that all 3 were printed at nearly the same time and represent 3 more or less concurrent projects of the DK shop. In each case, these are very early proofs, for they were not printed under a press, but rather by rubbing the paper from the back over the inked types, the same process used for printing many of the early block books. This created deep impressions and makes the surrounding quads locking up the types in place very conspicuous. They were not blocked off from the inking by friscuits. In fact, these Krakow proofs, could we see slide 15, please, provide us overall with perhaps the sharpest, cleanest impressions we possess of the DK font type by type. Slide 16, please. The Krakow partial page of the Latin Bible covers Genesis 3:19 to 4:16 with gaps, with the beginnings of the lines in column A trimmed off. As first calculated by Karl Wehmer, who published a classic monograph on the Krakow Proofs in 1948, the fully set page would have been in 2 columns of 40 lines each. And if such a Bible began, as it surely would have, with Jerome's 2 prologues, K1 and K2 as we have shorthanded them, this would have been the recto of the 7th leaf of the book. We can go further in our calculations. As already noted several times, the DK type is considerably taller in body than the Gutenberg Bible type, and the columns of this proof page are wider than the columns of the Gutenberg Bible. The full type page of this DK type setting would have been about 330 by 215 millimeters, too large a page to print as a royal folio. Gutenberg must have been experimenting with the production of a Latin Bible in even larger format, an imperial folio, whose leaf dimensions would have been about 47 by 34 centimeters, compared with a royal folio of about 40 or 41 by 30 centimeters. And in a roundabout way, could we see slide 17? This reflects on another overlooked bibliographical curiosity in the workings of the DK shop. In late 1454, the DK shop printed a brief German pamphlet, a warning to Christianity against the Turks, generally called the Turken calendar, because it is presented in calendrical form, going month by month through the year 1455, and ending, slide 18 please, with a New Year's greeting for that year. The only known copy, once belonging to the German humanist Konrad Peutinger, is in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich. The bibliographical curiosity is that this pamphlet was printed as an octavo. That is, it was printed on bifolia of quarter sheets of paper, and the unique copy, although rather cut down at the bottom and outer margins, is, even in its trim state, too large to have been made of quarter sheets of royal paper. Thus, it must have been printed on imperial paper. The implication, although we have frankly reached the limits of our evidence, is that the DK shop had some specific reason, even in the closing months of 1454, when the Gutenberg Bible was still under production, to be acquiring rare and expensive imperial paper. The other significant point about this trial printing of a Latin Bible, using the DK type and planned as an imperial folio, is that the text was set from a manuscript, not from the Gutenberg Bible. Besides many small differences, there are 3 places on the page where the wording of the Krakow proof differs from the corresponding text of the Gutenberg Bible. One of the 3 is illustrated here, slide 19. This may be a little hard to see. In column A of the Krakow proof, we see, although the column is shaved on the left, the indentation for a 2-line initial space to begin chapter 4 of Genesis, with the words Adam, the A to be supplied by the rubricator, Adam vero cognovit Evam, and so Adam knew Eve. Well, in the Gutenberg Bible, the words are transposed, cognovit vero Adam Evam. The apparatus of the Rome Old Testament does not record any manuscript containing the words transposed as in the Gutenberg Bible. In fact, in a rare oversight, the editors of the Rome Old Testament did not even notice the Gutenberg Bible's reading, although in principle they ought to have. The Mentalin Bible. Of the 5 editions set directly from the Gutenberg Bible, 4 are anonymous and undated. Within this early group, only the 1462 Princeton Bible has a colophon, giving a clear statement of city, press, and date. Consider the Mentalin Bible, which we treat as the second Bible to be printed. Nothing in it reveals any of the information found in the Princeton colophon, and indeed the Mentalin Bible can be seen as the forgotten monument, the forgotten great monument of the early years of European printing. The copy of the Mentalin Bible at the University Library of Freiburg in Breisgau has 2 rubrication dates, slide 20. 1460 at the end of Volume 1 and 1461 at the end of Volume 2. This copy belonged to the Augustinian hermits of Oberndorf on the Neckar, about 50 miles southeast of Strasbourg. The older literature has therefore dated the edition not after 1461, based on the later rubrication date. However, the Mentalin Bible, which could be bound in either 1 or 2 volumes, was set, like the Gutenberg Bible, in 4 concurrent composition units, and so the entire edition would have been completed at essentially the same time. If Volume 1, as bound, of the Freiburg copy had its rubrication completed in 1460, this strongly implies, virtually necessitates, that the edition as a whole was completed that year, even if the rubricator of that particular copy did not finish his rubrication of Volume 2 until the following year. It is worth noting that the paper stock of the Mentalin Bible fits well with that date, for it is the identical paper on which were printed the paper copies of the first impression of the Mainz Catholicon, presumably the production of Johann Gutenberg, financed by Konrad Humery, with its explicit colophon date of 1460. Although almost none of the books printed in Mentalin's shop contain colophons, there is a documentary record showing that Mentalin, who concurrently held the office of Episcopal Notary in Strasbourg, must have been the printer of this Bible. Not, that is, literally the compositor or the pressman, both presumably plural individuals, but the master or chief financier of the printing shop. The Municipal Archives of Strasbourg preserve a contract dated 14 October 1461, in which the parish priest of St. Andrew in Strasbourg promised to pay Mentalin 12 Rhine gulden for a Bible, paying equal installments of 4 gulden each, the last payment due on All Saints 1462, and to it was added an annotation in which Mentalin attested that he had actually received full payment by the beginning of May 1462. And yet there is a sense in which the Mentalin Bible appears mysteriously, as if out of nowhere. We have nothing equivalent to the Helmsberger instrument or the report of Aeneas Sylvius for the Gutenberg Bible to give us any sense of its gestation. Strasbourg's printing history begins with an impressive royal folio, with no hint of any earlier quasi-experimental printing to have led up to it. Because the earliest documents of Mentalin's life in Strasbourg reach back into the 1440s, and because Gutenberg resided in Strasbourg into the 1440s, the date at which he returned to Mainz is not after 1448, but cannot be pinned down more closely. It has often been supposed that the two men knew each other. It has been speculated that Mentalin even journeyed to Mainz to learn the printing trade, but this is a pure guess. I don't like sending to people from one town to another if we don't have a clue whether it happened or not. The most striking feature of the Mentalin Bible is how widely different in character its font is from that of any of the early Mainz types, both the Textura Quadrata Formata of the DK type and the Gutenberg Bible types, and the smaller types, the smaller fonts used in the Cyprus indulgences of 1454 and in the 1459 Durandus of Fust and Schiffer. Mentalin, could we see slide 21, please? Mentalin was an accomplished scribe, and presumably the font is his own design. In its basis, it is a Gothic rotunda, but the capital letters are oversized by comparison with the minuscules. The ascenders are exaggeratedly tall. The letter A has a single loop, as in more cursive or hybrid scripts, and there is one striking humanist element, an exuberant ampersand, fully twice the width of the letter et for which it substitutes. By a happy accident of survival, a collection of proof pages survives for the first volume of Mentalin's Bible at Cambridge University Library. They were purchased by Henry Bradshaw at an 1870 Sotheby's auction for the grand figure of £4 17 and sat patiently on the library shelves for more than a century until they were looked at closely. These proofs were mostly printed not on the royal paper of the main print run, but rather on less expensive chancery paper of roughly half the size. Thus, every proof leaf is not a half leaf of a royal sheet, but a full chancery sheet, with horizontally running chain lines, with the watermark centered in either the top or the bottom half of the leaf, and with the original quire fold running horizontally across the center of the page, showing where the paper had been folded when it was originally packed into reams. Only a few of the leaves have hand corrections marking small changes to be made in the setting before the print run began. The great majority of the leaves seem to be what can be called final proofs, which were checked against earlier marked proofs to verify that any called-for changes had been carried out correctly. These proof leaves also show that the type font itself was still being modified as the printing began. The ascender, could we see slide 22, please? The ascender of the letter T in the earliest state of the page, that is the Cambridge proof of 1 recto, was hardly present at all, and the cross-stroke predominated, making the letter ambiguous in appearance. While the page was still in proof, almost all these ambiguous T's were replaced by ones of more conventional shape, with a clear ascender and a slightly broader crossbar. But the first of the T's remained on the page in the word frater. As a result, at least one incunabulist has transcribed the first word of Jerome's preface as frarar with a sic after the second supposed R. But that supposed R is in fact the earliest form of T in Mentalin's type. No sic is called for. Unlike the Gutenberg Bible, no copies of the Mentalin Bible were printed on vellum, nor, so far as we know, was there an accompanying table of rubrics. The spaces left in the Mentalin Bible for book and prologue tituli show no signs of being specially planned for particular wordings of tituli. Most commonly, there is a single blank line, sometimes two, sometimes less than a full line, in no discernible pattern. The Mentalin Bible is significantly rarer than the Gutenberg Bible, about 30 copies surviving, as against 49 integral copies and 15 copies documented by binding waste for the Gutenberg Bible. Extensive study of the early provenances of copies of the Mentalin Bible by Eric White reveals that many had ownerships in Strasbourg and the surrounding region. Others were sold eastward to Bavaria and Austria, and some were sold down the Rhine, with early ownerships traced to Boppard, south of Koblenz, to Cologne, and to Dinslaken, north of Cologne. At this time, the very early 1460s, most copies of the Gutenberg Bible had already been sold, so the Mentalin Bible would have been the only printed edition available. A British Library copy, we see slide 23, is of special interest. Its flyleaves contain an early manuscript, an elaborate acrostic eulogy of Mentalin by Sigismund Meisterlin, a Benedictine formerly of Ulrich and Afra in Augsburg, and then later at the Abbey of Murbach in southern Alsace. And Eric White has recently been able to localize its distinctive rubrications to Strasbourg and to a named artist, Johann Klingener. It may be noted that the copy of the Mentalin Bible at Queen's College in Oxford has its first leaf in expert facsimile copied from the British Library copy. The 36-line Bible. For centuries, the 36-line Bible, printed with a late version of Gutenberg's DK type, has been a more prominent incunable than the Mentalin Bible, as for a long time it was seen as a candidate for being the first printed Bible, as described from the recollections of Ulrich Zell, the first printer of Cologne, who had learned the craft of printing in Mainz's early years of typography. By Zell's account, in the Cologne Chronicle of 1499, the first Latin Bible had been printed by Gutenberg using a large type, he said, of the sort found in printed missals. This points to a Textura Quadrata font, and the only two incunable Bibles to meet the specification are indeed the Gutenberg or 42-line Bible and the DK type 36-line Bible. The fact that a copy of the 42-line Bible was rubricated in 1456, whereas the only rubrication date known for the 36-line Bible is 1461, created a presumption in favor of the 42-line Bible. Next slide, 24, please. But it was not until Karl Jatsko, in a seminar of his students, made a close side-by-side comparison of the two editions in 1890 that real proof could be given that the 42-line Bible was earlier, the specific proof being that the 36-line Bible was set from it. And if you look here, you see what the B36 compositor below did. That line of the Gutenberg Bible with the initial H that begins Haec dicet Dominus ego, then there's that little bracket. Vocatus est is the end of the line above. Quiet Angelus Domini vocatus est. But the compositor of the 36-line Bible didn't have a rubricated copy in front of him, and so he just set word by word what was in front of him. Haec dicet Dominus ego vocatus est, which has no meaning whatever, eduxi populum istum, etc. So the only way you get that accident is if you have the Gutenberg Bible in front of you as you're setting your type. The fact that the 36-line Bible was printed with the DK type automatically creates a connection, however it is to be interpreted, with Gutenberg's Mainz workshop, and easily a half dozen different scenarios have been written by scholars cum playwrights since Jatzko first established the fundamental relationship that B36 is a child of B42. The tantalizing Krakow fragmentary proof of a 40-line Bible set with a DK type has opened the door to still more scenarios. At this moment, the Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucke, in its online version, has swallowed up the Krakow Bible proof into its entry for the 36-line Bible, treating it as a Probedruck, or trial printing for the 36-line Bible. This cannot be right. A partial typesetting of a 40-line Bible intended as an imperial folio, printed in Mainz, circa 1457, cannot be considered a trial for a 36-line Bible in royal folio, printed in Bamberg, not after 1461. The type apart, nothing matches. The fundamental problem is that the DK type itself was indeed used in two printing shops in two different cities, first in Mainz, as early as the early 1450s, and as late, at a minimum, as 1456, and second in Bamberg, where a chancery folio edition of the German fable book Eggerstein, uniquely preserved of Wolfenbüttel, has a colophon stating that it was printed in Bamberg on Valentine's Day, 1461. And another German edition, known as the Vier Historien, the Four Histories, has a colophon dated 1462, not long after St. Walburg's feast, the 1st of May, and naming that printer as Albrecht Pfister. Thus, the 36-line Bible has been in a kind of Solomonic tug-of-war between two cities, some 120 miles apart, west and east on the River Main. Two great English authorities, Robert Proctor and BMC I, came down without qualification for the western city Mainz, placing the 36-line Bible in the shop of a blandly titled printer or printers of the 31-line Indulgence and 36-line Bible. We can say today with confidence that this was the wrong answer and that the 36-line Bible was printed in Bamberg. Such is the slow rate of progress in incunable studies. With Bamberg, we are now back to the localization made by Georg Wolfgang Panzer in 1796 in Volume 4 of his Annales Typographicae, retracting his earlier assignment of the 36-line Bible to Mainz. Slide 25, please. The most accurate census of copies has been made by Eric White, who has corrected many earlier errors and obscurities in provenance. By his count, 14 integral copies survive, all on paper, and 7 vellum copies, plus at least 1 paper copy, are documented by binding waste. It is almost a paradox. The paper copies were more successful at surviving than their vellum siblings. The indications that the 36-line Bible was printed in Bamberg are various and convincing. 2 of the integral copies are in bindings localizable to Bamberg. The copy at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France contains the painted arms of a doctor of laws and imperial diplomat, Peter Canor. Among the many church livings he held, bringing him a large income, was a canonry of Bamberg Cathedral. We note parenthetically that this copy was earlier in the Harleian collection, and so was among the printed books purchased from the second Earl of Oxford's widow by Thomas Osborne, and offered in the 1743 Latin Catalogue of the Harleian Library. It is number 59 in Osborne's catalogue, and the entry was very likely composed by the impecunious Samuel Johnson. He tells us only that it is an old edition, editio antiqua, printed with square letters, painted initials, and 3 volumes of Russia leather. The memorial book, or Totenbuch, of the Franciscans of Coburg records that in 1463 the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Georg von Schaumburg, presented to them a printed Bible. This is certainly the copy of the 36-line Bible of which 3 vellum leaves are in the Staatsarchiv of Coburg, used as wrappers on account books of the Hospital of St. George there for the years 1578, 1579, and 1589. And recently, Eric White discovered that the paper copy of the 36-line Bible, now divided between the Rylands Library in Manchester and the Scheide Library in Princeton, had originally been given by the same bishop, Georg, in 1468 to the Benedictines of Aurach in Lower Franconia, the gift inscription being preserved on a vellum flyleaf of the first volume. This copy belonged to the Schotten Cloister in Würzburg and was sold to Lord Spencer by the Scottish Benedictine of that abbey, Alexander Horne, who was very active in supplying early printed rarities to both Spencer and to George III. In January 1801, Horne wrote to the Earl, "Your Lordship must not forget to keep the first leaf, as it preserves the date." But when the volumes were rebound in England, the documentary flyleaf was thrown away. Horne's autographed letter in the British Library preserves the evidence. So our simplest picture of the 36-line Bible must be that it was printed in Bamberg under the patronage of Prince Bishop Georg, that the printing shop was under the direction of Albrecht Pfister, who is recorded in a number of Bamberg documents as, among other things, secretary to the bishop, and that the types were acquired from Gutenberg's shop in Mainz. This roughly at the time in the later 1450s, when Gutenberg's own energies were focused on production of the already mentioned massive Latin dictionary, the Catholicon of Johannes Balbus, completed in Mainz in 1460. The Bamberg project would have required a considerable outlay of money for type making, for whereas the Mainz DK shop must have been small, the Bamberg Bible shop required sufficient type for concurrent setting of large pages in 4 composition units. Although a direct connection cannot be drawn, it has been noted that in December 1459, the large sum of £523 was removed on loan from the Domschatz by the canons of the cathedral, and that by May 1461, the loan had not been repaid. We see slide 26, please. In the earliest settings of the 36-line Bible, this type looks, in fact, remarkably fresh, sharper than we find it in most of the DK type printing in Mainz, the fragmentary Krakow proof impressions apart. Of the early editions of the Vulgate Bible, the 36-line Bible was by far the most extensive in terms of royal-size sheets. Its 884 leaves come to 442 sheets in each copy, almost 90% of a ream of paper. This is well over twice the length in paper of the contemporary Mentalin Bible, which was set with 49 as against 36 lines to the column and in a much narrower font. The Bamberg edition was planned to be bound in 2 volumes, the first ending in Psalms, the second beginning in Proverbs, but because of the excessive thickness of volumes this entailed, 6 of the surviving copies were bound in 3 volumes, Volume 2 ending with Lamentations and Volume 3 beginning with Baruch. This was not a natural choir break or textual break, and was also awkward in separating the prophets into 2 different volumes. The 36-line Bible was sold with a printed table of rubrics, of which binding waste fragments survive. It copies the Gutenberg Bible's table of rubrics, but the spaces left in text for supply of the rubrics was not closely calculated as it was in the Gutenberg Bible. The 36-line Bible has a curious dual aspect. That is, it has 2 peculiarities, the one contingent upon the other. In the first days, the that it was being printed, the Bible was set from a manuscript, not from the Gutenberg Bible. That manuscript was used for setting the first 9 pages of the first composition unit, beginning with Jerome's prologues. That's pages 1 recto to 5 recto of the first quire, and also for the first 3 pages of the second composition unit, beginning with Jerome's prologue to 1 Chronicles and continuing on to the beginning of chapter 2. That's 1 recto to 2 recto of the 28th quire. When the compositor of the first unit began setting 5 verso, the page on which Jerome's general prologue ends and his prologue to the Pentateuch begins, that compositor now had a copy of the Gutenberg Bible available and used it as his setting copy. And similarly, the compositor setting 1 Chronicles got leaves of the Gutenberg Bible in front of him as a replacement for the manuscript he had been using just when he began to compose the 4th page of his stint, that is, 2 verso of the quire he was working on. Then, just as with the Gutenberg Bible, a decision was made to increase the edition size. We have no idea of the edition run of the 36-line Bible, but the survival record strongly implies that it was considerably less than that of the Gutenberg Bible. So the figures given here are purely arbitrary, given only to suggest a relative scale. Let us say that originally the print run was of 50 copies. After leaf 5 verso of the first quire had been set and printed, this at just the time, it will be recalled, that a Gutenberg Bible entered the printing shop, it was decided to increase the edition to, let's say, 80 copies. Therefore, from 6 recto to 10 verso of that first quire, that's the second half of the 5 sheets, 50 impressions of those pages were printed on the sheets that already had their first halves printed, pages 1 recto to 5 verso. Then 30 more copies were printed on sheets whose first 5 leaves were blank, and those blank leaves would have to be printed later, filling them with the missing text. See slide 27, please. The 2 settings of the first gathering of the 36-line Bible are easy to distinguish, for the manuscript originally used has a large number of textual variants from the Gutenberg Bible, starting with Jerome's first sentence beginning Frater Ambrosius. And so you see setting A and setting B even lay out the initial space for Frater Ambrosius in different ways. It has not, however, been previously noticed that there are 2 settings, not just of pages 1 recto to 5 recto, but also of 5 verso, despite the fact that it was set from the Gutenberg Bible and not from a manuscript. The reason is that the edition was not increased until 6 recto began to be printed, meaning that, say, 30 more copies of 5 verso also had to be printed. The first setting, let's see slide 28, please. The first setting of 5 verso starts off at a different place from the second setting. As I think you can see, the setting B starts with anorum, the continuation of Christianorum, si habes, which is the 4th line down in the first setting. So they start in very different places textually. The second compositor had to take this into account and adjust his setting to make sure to end his page with the same words as the first compositor had done, so that the text would read smoothly onto the following page 6 recto. Could we see slide 29, please? The ending words on that page are apud Hebraios duplicem. And when we put the 2 settings, A and B, A on the left, B on the right, side by side, we see how the second compositor achieved this. After at first varying, he copied the line endings of the first setting exactly for the last 10 lines, making sure he ended up in the right place. Just as with the mixed setting states of the different copies of the Gutenberg Bible, there are mixed setting states of the surviving copies of the 36-line Bible. And so, as with the Gutenberg Bible, there is that same fundamental distinction to be drawn between any particular copy of the edition, that is, a given sample of sheets, and the edition is an entity, that is, all the sheets that were printed and all the combinations of ways in which those sheets were gathered into saleable copies. All 4 possible variants of the 36-line Bible are represented by at least one copy. That is, you could have quires 1 and 28 both in the first setting, or setting A. That's true of the Scheide copy. You could have them both in the second setting, or setting B, as in the British Library or King George III copy. You could have the first quire setting A, the 28th quire setting B, as in the Leipzig University Library copy. And to round it out, you could have quire 1 in setting B, quire 28 in setting A, as in the Jena University Library copy. Eggerstein's Latin Bibles. We postponed to our last lecture the next printed Bible in chronological sequence, Fürstenschiffer's 1462 edition. For as already noted, this is the edition whose path led forward to a long line of textual successors, and the relations and differences between it and its immediate descendants need to be looked at in some detail. The second printer of Strasbourg, Heinrich Eggerstein, dominated the market for Latin Bibles in the second half of the 1460s, publishing 3 editions, the only 3 appearing, between 1466 and 1469, or possibly very early 1470, all with texts derived from the Gutenberg Bible. Of the 3 editions combined, about 160 copies survive, each copy having apparently a very limited vellum issue of 1 or 2 each. Their strongest selling area was east of Strasbourg, across Swabia, Bavaria, and Austria. Heinrich Eggerstein, M.A. of some university, was a citizen of Strasbourg in the early 1440s, and he must have been acquainted with Gutenberg there, as they were both members of a civic association called the Nachkünstler, who each paid a tax sufficient for the half maintenance of a horse towards the defense of the city. Again, a variety of scenarios can be written by which Eggerstein would have come to be involved in typography, particularly as he apparently surrendered his citizenship in Strasbourg between the years 1457 and 1459. So there we do have a hint of travels, but we will remain simply with his 3 Latin Bible editions, all unsigned and undated. Slide 30, please. Of his first edition, 4 copies have rubrication dates of 1466, one the 24th of May, 1466. And this same year, Eggerstein was granted a letter of protection, naming him specifically as a Buchdrucker and affording him trading privileges by the Elector Palatine Friedrich I. Eggerstein's second Bible edition, hardly distinguishable in overall appearance from his first, of that edition 4 copies bear rubrication or purchase dates of 1468. Then for his third edition, Eggerstein used as exemplar a different copy of the Gutenberg Bible from the one he had in 1466. And this copy is very fortunately preserved in Cambridge University Library. Slide 31, please. As the keystone of a choice and spectacular group of early printed books and manuscripts, concentrated on Bibles that were quietly given in 1933 by a London barrister, Arthur William Young, graduate of Trinity College, Cambridge, in the 1870s. This copy had apparently been acquired in Strasbourg around 1700 by Charles Hope, 1st Earl of Hopetoun, possibly sold to him or his agent by the Collegiate Church of Saint-Pierre-le-Jeune. The details cannot be pinned down precisely, but at least 5 other incunables with this provenance entered the Hopetoun House Library. And one other ex-Hopetoun incunable at Cambridge has also a close connection with Strasbourg. It is a copy of Mentalin's edition of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, with an inscription by one M. Foresius saying he had acquired it personally from Mentalin on the 10th of April, 1469. And we know a bit about Foresius. He owned other surviving cunables, and is recorded as a seal bearer of the Bishop of Strasbourg. As you see, the Cambridge Gutenberg Bible is a very handsome copy with extensive illumination of quality that can be localized to Strasbourg, and also with handsome, sometimes rather lively, alternating red and blue chapter initials. But its historically significant features an element that you might say makes the copy less clean. That is, the extensive marginal markings on almost every page, beginning to end, of small hash or hatch marks. It is these marks, aligned with unobtrusive vertical strokes within the lines of type, which prove that the Cambridge Gutenberg Bible, slide 32 please, was the exemplar in Eggerstein's shop for setting his third edition of the Latin Bible. With exceptions only where there are identifiable and indicative accidents in the setting of Eggerstein's third edition, these marks, or rather the strokes within the lines to which they attach, mark exactly the last word of a particular page of Eggerstein's setting and show the compositor at what word to begin setting the following page. And you see that here. You see Gutenberg Bible at the top, the last word, tertii, second line up. That's the stroke marking the division between fluminus and tertii. In Eggerstein's Bible, fluminus ends one page, tertii begins another. Eggerstein seems to have had some access of ambition with this third printing of the Bible, by contrast with his first two. It marks the first use of a second font of the same Gothic rotunda style as his first, clearly influenced by the font of Fuston Schuffer's 1462 Bible, but enlarged in size to essentially the body height of the Gutenberg Bible. Eggerstein's first two editions were set in columns of 45 lines, and copies contained 496 leaves. This third edition was made much larger, set to columns of 41 lines, and a full copy contains 632 leaves, just 11 leaves less than the Gutenberg Bible itself. It was issued with a table of rubrics whose titularly changed their wordings in many places from the table of the Gutenberg Bible. There also survives, slide 33 please, a broadside printed advertisement for the edition by Eggerstein, with great claims of its careful collation by men deeply immersed in the humane arts, and a by then rather old-fashioned boast that it was produced not by pen or reed, but by the ingenious art of stamping letters. Presumably a sign of the role of these learned men was an extensive, though sporadic, campaign of emendation, where alternative readings from some manuscript of the Bible that they had on hand were added to the text. Such emendations were written in the margin in some places, it being understood that the compositor would incorporate them in his typesetting. But in many other places, findable only through side-by-side collation, the Gutenberg Bible itself is not marked, and presumably the emendations in the Eggerstein edition were made at an invisible proofing stage. In all, there are some 180 written marginal emendations in the Cambridge Gutenberg Bible, but clustered in relatively few places across the four major composition units. And there is more than double that number of hidden or silent emendations. They are so scattershot in their balance of positive and negative readings that it cannot be said that this is a textually improved presentation of the Vulgate Bible. In each composition unit, it appears that the secondary correcting manuscript was not brought into play until a number of quires had already been set. For instance, in the first composition unit, starting with the Pentateuch, there is no marginal emendation made until chapter 7 of Deuteronomy. Parenthetically, after I first wrote about the Cambridge copy, another scholar suggested that the emendations might reflect a Bible of Windesheim use, but gave no evidence, for instance, of some indicative Windesheim reading. It can be stated positively that there is no evidence in favor of the suggestion and a flood of evidence against it. For example, one of the books that was amended was Apocryphal for Ezra, a book that was not included in the Windesheim Bible. This in itself is curious and revealing, as 4 Ezra was absent from the strong majority of Vulgate Bibles of the 13th century and after, and was even rarer before the 13th century. In my sample group of 85 15th century Bible manuscripts, only 13 include 4 Ezra. This gives us, however, slide 34, a particularly interesting emendation that the Eggerstein compositor did bring correctly into the text. And depending on your eyesight, here in the first, this is 4 Ezra, the beginning of 4 Ezra chapter 3. And here in the first verse of chapter 3 of 4 Ezra, we find written in the margin of the Cambridge Gutenberg Bible that very phrase, ego salatio quiet Ezra, I Salathiel, also known as Ezra, that was intentionally removed from 4 Ezra by an editor in the Gutenberg Bible shop. And of course it was there because all manuscripts of 4 Ezra had it. Because the Gutenberg Bible's version of 4 Ezra was sifted down into the Clementine Vulgate, these authentic words of chapter 3 disappeared from view until the later 19th century, when 4 Ezra began to be edited by scholars from manuscripts. But all the time, the words were lurking within this Eggerstein printing of the Latin Bible, unnoticed and uncopied by later printers. We see slide 35. There is one other, well, even smaller place where we see a reflection of the layout of the unknown manuscript used in Eggerstein's shop for various emendations. The book of 3 Ezra in the Gutenberg Bible was divided into 9 chapters, as it still is today, though with some change of placement of a couple of chapter numbers, and as it was in a large number of Paris Bibles and other Bibles influenced by Paris chaptering. In Eggerstein's 3rd edition, editorially, the number of chapters was increased from 9 to 12 by marking off 3 more places where 2-line initials were to be set. We can see one such mark in the Cambridge Gutenberg Bible. It's that little bow in front of the word anno, the second line down, and that means make a chapter here. That's the instruction. And if you look over in the margin, very small, you see 19, XIX. This indicates that the manuscript used for emending had its 3 Ezra chaptered according to an older system, a system which divided the book into 27 chapters, rather like the old capitular divisions of other books of the Bible. Bibles writing 3 Ezra with 27, or sometimes variants of 25 or 26 chapters, are not rare and continued into the 15th century as a parallel system to the more standard 9 chapters. And these many-chaptered 3 Ezras almost always mark their chapter 19 at exactly this place, the modern equivalent of chapter 8, verse 6. Not far from us, Balliol Manuscript 2, a Bible written in Italy in the later 13th century, contains both 3 and 4 Ezra, and its 3 Ezra has 27 chapters, with chapter 19 being 8:6, exactly like what is on the screen. One last page of the Cambridge Gutenberg Bible should be looked at, for it contains a marginal hand correction, slide 36 please, that was not made in Eggerstein's shop preparatory to setting, but many years earlier in Mainz, in the Gutenberg Bible shop. This page is a good candidate for being a marked proof page of the Gutenberg Bible. In any case, it contains the earliest known textual state of this page. The text is 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 22, and the margin notes 2 words, theoretically a name to be inserted at Sesa, Safat et Sesa, 6 in number, 6 numero. In all other copies, can we see slide 37, et Sesa is set in type. So that's an instruction for a correction to be made. And go back briefly to 36 and it's 37 again. To put those two little words into the second line, in fact, they had to reset 8 lines of that column to come out even again. As noted earlier, the Cambridge copy of the Gutenberg Bible was handled carefully in Eggerstein's shop, for it was and was to be maintained as a saleable copy, even some 14 years after its sheets were printed. The placement of the compositorial marks on certain pages show us that at the time it was used for copy setting, it already contained its illuminated major initials, but it had not yet been rubricated. At several places, the rubrications lie on top of the compositor's marks, which thus occupy the middle stratum as the sheets moved from the artist's workshop to the printing shop, and then on, third, to the rubricator's shop. Thereafter, the copy was bound and sold, but apparently never left Strasbourg until it made its way to England more than 2 centuries later. In the final lecture, we will examine Fürstenschiffer's 1462 Bible and its fruitful line of descendants. Thank you.